Right after the funeral of the millionaire father, the stepmother pushes the little girl out of the house. In tears, she begs, "Please, Mom, don't leave me alone on the street. It's dangerous for me." The stepmother just wanted to get rid of the burden of caring for the girl. What she never imagined was that, at the exact moment of the cruel act, the father would appear. Seconds later, his attitude changed everything, leaving the stepmother and the current man silent and remorseful. The scent of lilies was so thick it seemed to stick in your throat, a sweet, cold fragrance that clashed with the warmth of the memories Lena held of her father. Sitting in an uncomfortably tall velvet chair, her feet dangling inches from the floor, she watched the room at the City Club. People spoke in whispers, but their stares were loud, curious, judging the performance of Isadora, her stepmother. And Isadora, dressed in elegant, sober mourning, was putting on a flawless show. Her eyes, skillfully teary, glistened under the light of the chandeliers, and her silk handkerchief was brought to her face at perfectly timed intervals. She spoke of her husband, of his brilliance in business, of the immense fortune he had built with an almost prophetic vision for the future, mentioning in passing his risky investments in cryptocurrencies that to everyone's surprise, had yielded an extraordinary profit. Lena, however, saw the small cracks in the mask. She saw the almost imperceptible tightening of her lips at the end of each sentimental phrase, the way her gaze would dart to Richard, her companion, who remained discreetly on standby, offering a glass of water or a supportive touch on the shoulder. It was a rehearsed ballet, and the little girl, with the sharp clarity of her 8 years, felt like the only one in the audience who knew the actors were lying. The memorial was rushed, more a social event than a sentimental one, replacing the ceremony her father would have wanted with speeches that sounded more like reports on his achievements and his vast fortune. When the last condolences had been received and the last trays of canapés cleared, the ride home was silent. The car glided through the tree-lined streets of Prescott Hills, passing imposing facades that seemed to guard their own secrets. Lena clutched the strap of her small school backpack, where she kept her greatest treasure, the last picture she had taken with her father, the two of them smiling on a boat, the sun exploding on the horizon. As they reached the mansion, the iron gates opened with a low, dragging groan. The house, once a place of laughter and the smell of chocolate chip cookies, now felt like a cold mausoleum. Isadora got out of the car first, her face transformed. The mask of the grieving widow had fallen, revealing a hard, steel-like expression. Richard followed, a satisfied smirk barely contained on his lips. He stood beside her like a soldier awaiting orders. Lena got out last, her small shoes making a hollow sound on the stone path, still damp from the previous night's rain. It was then that Isadora turned to her, her voice a sharp whisper, colder than the night air. "The house needs some peace now," she said, without a trace of the emotion she had displayed at the club. She took the wheeled suitcase the driver had already removed from the trunk and pushed it toward Lena, along with the backpack. The gesture was so quick, so final, that the girl barely had time to react. She looked at the face of the woman who had once insisted on being called Mom and saw a stranger. A door was closing before her, the door to her own home, and she was on the outside. "Please, Mom, don't do this to me!" The plea escaped her lips, a trembling, desperate wisp of a voice. Isadora ignored her. With a nod to Richard, she turned and walked toward the entrance, her heels echoing like hammer blows in the silence. The great oak door closed with a final click, and the sound of the deadbolt turning was the loneliest sound Lena had ever heard in her entire life. Across the street, hidden in the shadow of a stone pillar, a car with its engine off remained motionless, its presence unnoticed, witnessing the scene with a heavy, stunned silence. Night fell over the neighborhood like a dark velvet veil, sprinkled with golden lights winking from the windows of the other mansions. Indifferent to the small drama unfolding at the Albright family gate, Lena remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, the handle of the rolling suitcase growing cold in her palm. The sound of the lock became an echo in her mind. Every passing headlight was a spark of hope, followed by a wave of disappointment. He wasn't coming. Her father wasn't coming. The reality of the word missing began to settle in her chest like a stone. The lump in her throat was so tight she could barely breathe. The night's chill began to seep through her thin coat, and she shivered, a tremor that came as much from helplessness as from the cold breeze. It was then that a light came on in the house across the street. Mrs. Eleanor's house. A woman with hair as white as cotton and eyes that seemed to hold all the stories of the neighborhood. The curtain moved, and moments later, the front door opened. Mrs. Eleanor's silhouette appeared. Hesitant, she looked at the Albright mansion, then at the small figure huddled at the gate, and her face contorted into an expression of pure disbelief. She crossed the street with slow but steady steps, her wool cardigan wrapped around her shoulders. "Lena, my dear, what are you doing out here at this hour?" Her voice was gentle, like the scent of chamomile. Lena couldn't answer, only lifting her eyes, large and filled with silent tears. Mrs. Eleanor needed no further explanation. With a kindness Lena hadn't felt in weeks, she took the girl's free hand. "Come, get inside. You'll catch your death of cold." Mrs. Eleanor's house was the opposite of the mansion, small, cozy. It smelled of lemon-polished wood and herbal tea. A grandfather clock ticked in the living room, a constant, calming sound. She sat Lena in a soft armchair and placed a blanket over her legs. As she prepared some tea, she spoke in a low voice, more to herself than to the girl. "Your father was a good man. He had a heart bigger than all that wealth, helped me fix my roof when my husband got sick, never asked for a thing in return, never forgot his friends. Even after he became a multi-millionaire," she sighed, placing the steaming mug in Lena's hands. "To leave a child outside, what kind of heart does that?" In that small refuge, Lena felt the first warmth of safety since the memorial. She allowed herself a small sip of tea, the hot liquid going down like an embrace, but the peace was brutally shattered by the doorbell, a shrill sound that cut through the comforting silence. Mrs. Eleanor went to answer, and Isadora's voice, falsely melodic, invaded the room. "Mrs. Eleanor, I am so sorry for the trouble. There's been a misunderstanding. Lena has such a vivid imagination." Isadora swept into the room, Richard a silent bodyguard right behind her. Her eyes scanned the cozy space with disdain. She smiled at Lena, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Come on, sweetheart. We have to go." She grabbed Lena's arm, her red-painted nail digging slightly into the girl's skin. "But where will she stay?" protested Mrs. Eleanor, concern creasing her brow. Isadora adjusted the collar of her designer coat, her tone becoming condescending and final. "Don't you worry. I've made arrangements. The school will handle it." The phrase hung in the air, cold and filled with an impersonal authority. She pulled Lena out of the house, back into the dark night, leaving the old woman standing in her doorway, helpless, with the smell of tea and the bitter feeling of an injustice she could not prevent. The interior of the luxury car was a cocoon of leather and silence. Lena sat in the back, huddled against the door, watching the city lights blur into colorful streaks through the window. Isadora and Richard, in the front seats, conversed in low, confidential murmurs, a hissing sound that was more oppressive than the silence. Occasionally, a word would stand out: estate, lawyers, shares. They were adult words, words that in their mouths sounded like weapons. Lena didn't understand what they meant, but she felt their weight, the way they seemed to justify the coldness with which they were treating her. She was just an item on a to-do list, a small liability to be managed so they could have unrestricted access to her father's assets. The journey ended in front of an old, imposing building, surrounded by a high wall topped with iron spikes. A polished brass plaque read, the Blackwood Academy. It looked less like a school and more like a place where things were stored, not taught. A woman with a tight bun and a severe expression met them in the lobby, which smelled of disinfectant and floor wax. Isadora resumed her role as the concerned mother. "She's going through a very delicate time," she told the headmistress, her voice dripping with a compassion she didn't feel. "She needs a structured environment. Consider it an essential investment in her well-being." The word investment sounded as if she were buying an object, not ensuring a child's care. The headmistress nodded, her gaze passing over Lena as if she were a package to be catalogued. Isadora signed some papers, swiped a credit card, and with one last forced smile, turned to the girl. "Be a good girl, Lena. It's for the best." There was no hug, just a fleeting touch on the shoulder. Then she and Richard were gone, their footsteps echoing down the marble hall, leaving Lena behind under the cold lights and the impersonal gaze of this stranger. A silent monitor led her through a maze of corridors to a small, austere room. There was a narrow bed, a desk, and a wardrobe. The window, with thin bars, overlooked a concrete courtyard. The door closed, and for the second time that night, Lena heard the sound of a lock turning. The helplessness hit her with full force, a cold wave that made her tremble. She sat on the edge of the bed, hugging her backpack as if it were the last remnant of her world. The tears she had held back for so long finally came, silent and hot. In a desperate search for a familiar comfort, she unzipped the side pocket of her backpack, where she kept her small treasures. Her fingers found something that shouldn't have been there, a folded piece of paper, already yellowed and soft with age. She unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable, hurried but full of personality. It was from her father, an old note from one of his business trips. The words seemed to leap off the page, a whisper from the past directly into her desolate present. "My little star, if I'm delayed, trust our code word. It's the key to everything. Love." "Dad," a sob escaped her lips, but it wasn't just of sadness, it was a glimpse of something else. Hope, a code word, a key. It was a promise, a code just for them. But what was it? Her childish mind scoured her memories, the games, the bedtime stories. What could it be? In the midst of her concentration, a sound made her jump. The sound of footsteps approaching down the hall, stopping right in front of her door. Lena's heart pounded. It wasn't the monitor. These were heavy, slow steps, and they were coming for her. The doorknob turned with a metallic creak that made Lena's heart leap. The door opened to reveal not a threatening figure, but the same silent monitor as before, her face a blank canvas. The relief was as immediate as the disappointment that followed. For a moment, a stubborn, childish part of her had hoped it would be her father, or even Mrs. Eleanor, coming to rescue her. The woman gestured with her head, a silent command for Lena to follow. Lena obeyed, putting the note back in her pocket, feeling the fragile paper against her fingers like a talisman. They walked through corridors that all looked the same, to a cavernous and silent dining hall. Other children of various ages ate in disciplined silence, their eyes downcast, fixed on their plates. No one laughed. No one talked. The only sound was the clinking of silverware. Lena sat where she was told and pushed the tasteless food around her plate, her mind miles away. The code word. What could it be? She closed her eyes, trying to transport herself back to the library in her house, their favorite place. She remembered the smell of leather and paper, the dusty sunlight streaming through the window, and her father's deep voice reading to her about great navigators and hidden treasures. He always said the best riches weren't gold or dollars kept in a vault, but the stories and memories they built together. The word was an anchor in her storm, and she clung to that idea with all her might. While Lena was lost in her memories, at the Albright mansion, the atmosphere was one of restrained celebration. Isadora poured 2 glasses of champagne, the liquid bubbling like her satisfaction. "A toast," she said, raising her glass to Richard. To a new beginning, with no loose ends. Richard smiled, his eyes gleaming with a hungry ambition. He walked to the grand living room window, looking out at the immaculately manicured garden. The beginning, yes, but we need to move quickly, Isadora. The estate is vast, but it's also complex. Lawyers, advisors, they'll all want a piece. We need to consolidate our control. He turned, his tone now more serious and practical. First thing tomorrow is to change all the locks, the doors, the gates, the office. No one gets in or out without our permission. Next, I'll contact some discreet brokers. There are certain assets, artwork, maybe even the vintage car that we can liquidate quickly for immediate cash flow. Capital that will give us room to maneuver while the main probate is tied up. Isadora frowned for a moment. The idea of selling her husband's things so soon bothered her, not out of sentimentality, but for what others might think. Appearances were everything. All in good time, Richard. First, the locks. We need security. She agreed, pragmatism winning over her concern for the facade. Little did she know that, in the kitchen, Celeste, the housekeeper who had served the family for over 20 years, heard every word. With a dish towel in her hands, she stood motionless, her aged face a mask of sadness and contained anger. She had watched Lena grow up, knew the love Arthur had for his daughter. This was more than an injustice, it was a desecration. The next day, when the locksmith arrived and the sound of a drill echoed through the house, Celeste watched from the service pantry window. The sound was like a violation, the house being stripped of its memories, its soul. She wiped a stubborn tear with the back of her hand and, with a sudden decision, walked to her small room at the back of the house. She opened an old sewing box and, from beneath spools of thread and buttons, her fingers found what they were looking for. A small, cold, metallic object. It was a small brass key, worn with time, with a delicate anchor charm hanging from it. The days at Blackwood Academy dragged on in a grey monotony. Classes were rigid, recesses were silent, and the nights were terribly long. Lena clung to the routine like a lifeline, doing her homework with a fierce concentration, not for the love of learning, but to keep her mind occupied, to ward off the despair that lurked in the corners of her austere room. The only spark of color in her world was her father's note. She read it every night before sleep, the words becoming a mantra, a promise. Trust our code word. The word still eluded her, dancing at the edge of her memory like a stubborn firefly. Meanwhile, life at the Albright mansion blossomed in a new direction. Isadora, free from the responsibility of caring for Lena, dove headfirst into her role as a powerful philanthropic widow. She hosted charity brunches, received important society figures, and spoke eloquently about her husband's future plans, plans that, conveniently, she would now execute. Richard was always by her side, the perfect business partner, his presence solidifying Isadora's image as a woman who, despite the tragedy, was moving forward with courage and determination. Changing the locks was just the beginning. Soon, Lena's toys, which once filled an entire room, were quietly boxed up and donated to an orphanage. Isadora justified the act over coffee with her friends as a way to transform pain into charity, a gesture that earned her looks of admiration and solidarity. To Celeste, the housekeeper, every change was a knife to the heart. Seeing Isadora's dresses take over the entire walk-in closet while Lena's small clothes were given away as if they had no value was almost unbearable. She moved through the house like a ghost, her eyes observing everything, her mouth sealed by years of discreet service. But her loyalty was not to the new mistress of the house, but to the memory of her former employer and the child he loved so dearly. She knew she had to act, but how? A simple housekeeper against Isadora's immense wealth and influence. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Isadora tasked her with organizing the books in the office for an appraisal. "Get rid of anything old or irrelevant," she said dismissively. "We need space for the new ventures." As she dusted the shelves, Celeste's heart pounded. She found Arthur's old day planner, a worn leather volume he always kept close. She flipped through the pages carefully. There were notes on investments, meeting reminders, ideas for new projects, but amidst the numbers and strategies, something caught her eye. Next to a list of donation amounts for charities, he had written a single word: harbor. The same word appeared several times, always linked to significant sums of his capital, as if it were a code for a specific account or fund. Celeste felt a chill, the anchor on the key, harbor. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a clue. The following weekend, during visiting hours at the academy, Celeste showed up. Her presence was a welcome surprise for Lena, a familiar face in a sea of strangers. They sat on a bench in the concrete courtyard, under the watchful eye of a monitor. Celeste couldn't speak openly. With a quick, discreet movement while fixing Lena's hair, she pressed the small brass key into the girl's hand. Her lips barely moved as she whispered a single word, a warm breath against Lena's ear. Harbor. The word echoed in the girl's mind, colliding with the notes from her father that Celeste had mentioned. The code word. In that instant, in the grey courtyard of the school, Lena understood. Harbor was the key, literally and figuratively, but what did it open? The small brass key was cold and solid in Lena's palm, a heavy secret she kept in her uniform pocket. The word harbor resonated in her mind, no longer an enigma, but a destination. During classes, she drew small anchors in the margins of her notebooks, her thoughts flying far from the classroom, back to the library in the mansion. She had to get back. The opportunity, like before, arose from Isadora's need to keep up appearances. The school organized a family day event, an occasion for parents to visit and see their children's progress. For Isadora, not attending would be an unforgivable social misstep. She arrived at the academy in a new car, wearing a white linen suit that made her look ethereal and pure. Richard accompanied her, always a step behind, the picture of discreet support. Lena had to endure an hour of forced smiles and rehearsed questions about her grades and behavior. "I hope you're appreciating this opportunity, Lena," Isadora said, her voice low so only she could hear. "This place costs a small fortune. It would be a shame to waste so much money." The threat was veiled, but clear. Lena just nodded, her eyes fixed on a point beyond her stepmother's shoulder. The ride back to the mansion was tense. Lena knew she had a very small window of opportunity. Her mind worked feverishly, planning every step. Upon arriving at the mansion, Isadora announced she was going to rest before an important dinner. Celeste. "Make sure Lena doesn't disturb me." It was the cue Celeste and Lena had been waiting for. As soon as Isadora went upstairs, Celeste looked at Lena and nodded toward the library. "Go, I'll keep watch." Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. She entered the library, the silence of the room enveloping her like an old friend. The smell of books was the smell of home, the smell of her father. Her eyes scanned the tall shelves, filled with leather and paper spines. Which one? It had to be a special book, one that meant something to them, and then she saw it. On a lower shelf, almost hidden behind an old terrestrial globe, was a thick volume with a dark blue cover. The title in gold letters shone faintly in the dim light, Voyages of Discovery. It was the book he read to her on stormy nights, their voices mixing with the sound of the rain. Her small, trembling hands pulled out the heavy book. It felt strangely light. Behind it, on the back of the bookshelf, was a square recess, almost invisible, and in the center, a small brass keyhole, the exact size of the key with the anchor charm. With bated breath, Lena inserted the key. It turned smoothly, with an almost inaudible click. The small door swung open, revealing a secret compartment. There was no gold, no stacks of dollars. There was only a small, black, rectangular object, a USB drive. Lena picked it up, her fingers closing around it. It was light, almost insignificant, but she felt its weight, the weight of hope, of truth. She knew with a certainty that came from the depths of her soul that this tiny device held her father's voice. At that moment, upstairs, Isadora was on the phone with her bank manager. Her voice was firm, authoritative. "Yes, I understand the protocols, but the situation has changed. I need you to schedule a meeting. It's time to discuss the definitive administration of the family's funds and liquid assets. As the sole legal heir present, certain decisions need to be accelerated." She smiled as she spoke, imagining the wealth finally under her complete control, never knowing that one floor below, the true key to her husband's legacy was in the hands of an 8-year-old child. The USB drive seemed to burn in Lena's pocket. For 2 days, she carried it everywhere with her at the academy, the small plastic rectangle becoming the center of her universe. The problem was how to access it. The school computers were monitored, and asking any adult there for help was a risk she couldn't take. The solution came from an unexpected place. During computer class, as the teacher patiently explained how to create a slideshow presentation, Lena watched her movements. She saw how easily she plugged her own USB drive into the computer, how the files appeared on the screen. The seed of a plan began to sprout. She would need just a few minutes alone. The opportunity arose during the charity brunch Isadora decided to host at the mansion itself. It was to be the social event of the season, a demonstration of her resilience and generosity. The house was transformed, decorated with extravagant floral arrangements and impeccable table settings. Traces of the previous life, especially anything that recalled the presence of a child, were meticulously erased. Isadora, radiant in a silk dress, mingled with the guests, accepting compliments on her courage and talking about her plans to create a foundation in her late husband's name to support young talent. "It was his dream," she would say, her voice thick with calculated emotion, "to see his capital transformed into opportunities, to see the dividends of his life's work generate a greater good." Lena was brought to the mansion for the event, a necessary prop in Isadora's theater. She was meant to look like the well-cared-for stepdaughter, a living testament to her stepmother's kindness. Dressed in a frilly dress that scratched her skin, she was instructed to smile and be quiet. As Isadora gave her moving speech, Lena recognized the words. They were the same ones her father had written in his idea notebook, the same phrases he used when he talked to her about the true purpose of wealth. The shameless appropriation made Lena's blood boil. Seizing a moment when all eyes were on Isadora, who was symbolically cutting the ribbon on a portrait displaying the new foundation's logo, Lena slipped away. She ran up the stairs, her patent leather shoes muffled by the thick carpet. The office, her father's computer, it was her only chance. The door, now with a new lock, was secured. Despair threatened to swallow her. But then she remembered Celeste. The housekeeper, who was supposed to be supervising the kitchen, appeared silently in the hallway, as if she had read her mind. In her hand was a small ring of keys. With a conspiratorial glance, she unlocked the door and held it open. "Be quick, child." The computer whirred to life with a familiar hum. With trembling hands, Lena inserted the USB drive. A single video file appeared on the screen. She double-clicked it. Her father's face filled the monitor. He looked tired, but his eyes were as kind as ever. He was in a hotel room, judging by the background. "My little star," he began, his voice a balm to Lena's wounded soul. "If you're watching this, it means something has prevented me from returning or communicating. It could be that I'm just delayed, or it could be something more serious." He paused, taking a deep breath. "There are people who might try to convince you that I'm gone forever. People who might try to take what is yours from you. Don't believe them." His eyes seemed to look directly at her. "Our home, our memories, our future. It's all protected, but you need to be strong. Trust our signal. Trust the harbor. I love you more than all the shares on the stock market." The video ended. Lena sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. It was confirmation. He had prepared her. He knew something like this could happen. Outside, in the garden. The sound of a car approaching via the property's side entrance went unnoticed amid the music and conversation. A man got out of the vehicle, moving with a quiet urgency. He just needed to retrieve a folder he had forgotten in his personal safe before heading to a meeting with his lawyer. As he passed the front of the house, intending to leave through the main gate, he stopped, frozen. The scene in his garden hit him like a punch. Isadora, laughing and toasting, receiving applause. And there, near the gate, as if being presented, was his daughter, Lena, her eyes red from crying. For an instant, time stood still. He saw the theater, the sham, the celebration built upon his absence, and, most devastating of all, he saw the pain in his daughter's eyes. He stepped back into the shadow of an old oak tree, his heart hammering in his chest. The decision was made in that instant. He wasn't just going to show up. No. He was going to dismantle this lie, piece by piece. The sight of his daughter, a small, lonely figure amidst the celebration of his own absence, solidified Arthur's determination. The initial shock gave way to a cold, calculated fury. He retreated into the shadows, his heart heavy with the betrayal he had witnessed. He got back in his car and called his lawyer, his voice low and controlled, belying the storm within him. Change of plans, Horace. No direct confrontation, not yet. I want you to investigate every move Isadora has made since the news of my disappearance. Bank accounts, meetings, donations, every single cent. I want a full report on every asset she's tried to liquidate, and I want it yesterday. He hung up, his mind working at high speed. A dramatic return would be satisfying, but legally risky. Isadora could claim shock, trauma, manipulation by Richard. He needed more than his word against hers. He needed irrefutable proof, presented in a way that left no room for doubt. The public narrative, which she controlled so masterfully, had to be turned upside down with facts, not emotion. Meanwhile, Lena, after the video's revelation, felt a mix of relief and a new urgency. Knowing her father had anticipated the betrayal and prepared a defense strengthened her, but it also put her in a position of greater responsibility. The USB drive was her secret weapon, but a weapon she, an 8-year-old child, didn't know how to wield. In the days that followed, Isadora's pressure mounted. The meeting with the bank was approaching, and she needed to solidify her position. She began to speak openly about selling the mansion. "It's far too big for just the two of us," she'd tell anyone who would listen, casting a falsely compassionate glance at Lena. "We need a place with new memories, a place to start over. Besides, the capital tied up in this property could be better applied to the foundation's funds." For Lena, the thought of losing the house was terrifying. It was the last bastion of her father's memories, the place where every corner held a story, a laugh, a hug. The library, the garden where he taught her to ride her bike, the step on the staircase where he measured her height every birthday. To lose the house would be like losing him a second time. Definitively, Richard, smelling profit, accelerated his own plans. He pressed Isadora to organize an auction of items from Arthur's office. "They're just objects, darling," he argued, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Watches, fountain pens, art, things collectors would pay a fortune for. Think of it as honoring his memory by allowing others to appreciate his fine taste. The money raised can be the seed capital for your projects." Isadora, seduced by the idea of turning the past into more wealth and prestige, agreed. The auction date was set for the following week. The news fell like a bomb on Celeste and Lena. That office was Arthur's sanctuary, a place Isadora rarely entered. Selling his personal effects was the final act of erasure, the complete eradication of his identity from the house. Lena felt a rising panic. Time was running out. The auction was the ticking clock she couldn't ignore. She had to find a way to use her father's message to make someone listen. But who? The adults in her world were either deaf or complicit. Alone in her room at the academy, she looked at the anchor key she still kept with her. "Trust our signal," her father's voice echoed in her mind. The signal, the harbor. Maybe the secret wasn't just on the USB drive, but in something the harbor represented. With a new determination, she knew what she had to do. Find a way to talk to the one person who, besides Celeste, had shown her genuine kindness. She had to get to Mrs. Eleanor. Getting to Mrs. Eleanor was a logistical challenge that seemed insurmountable for an 8-year-old confined to a boarding school. Visits were controlled, phone calls monitored, and leaving the grounds of Blackwood Academy without permission was unthinkable. Lena's frustration grew daily, fueled by the mental image of her father's belongings being tagged and catalogued by strangers for the auction. Help, once again, came from the loyal Celeste. During her weekend visit, the housekeeper seemed more tense than usual. Her eyes had dark circles, and her hands fidgeted in her lap. "They're emptying the soul of the house, Lena," she whispered, her voice choked. "Every box they take is a piece of him that's gone." Lena squeezed the woman's wrinkled hand, feeling their shared urgency. "I need to talk to Mrs. Eleanor," Lena said, her voice firm. "She saw when Isadora left me at the gate. She believes me." Celeste pondered for a moment, her shrewd gaze assessing the supervised courtyard. "There's a book fair in the town square next Saturday," she said finally. "The school is taking some of the older students on a cultural outing. I told the headmistress you have a special interest in reading and that it would be good for your development." Isadora agreed. "She thinks it makes her look magnanimous." The plan was risky, but it was the only one they had. Celeste would contact Mrs. Eleanor and arrange the meeting. At the mansion, preparations for the auction were in full swing. Velvet-lined cases displayed Arthur's gold watches, his collector's pens, and even his leather-bound travel journals. Richard oversaw it all with the enthusiasm of a general about to conquer new territory. He took a particular pleasure in emptying the office, the nerve center of Arthur's power, and transforming it into a showroom for the sale of his legacy. Isadora, meanwhile, was focused on her own battle. The meeting with the bank had been more complicated than she'd expected. The directors, cautious men who had built careers managing the wealth of families like Arthur's, were not about to cede control easily. "There are clauses, Mrs. Albright," said the senior manager, a man with graying hair and a penetrating gaze. "Protective clauses for the heir, signed by your husband in his lifetime. They stipulate that in the case of a prolonged absence, the management of the primary assets is to be overseen by a trust board until the heir reaches the age of majority. Your access is limited to a generous stipend, but not total control of the capital." The news was a bucket of cold water. The fortune, the empire she believed was within her grasp, was protected by a wall of bureaucracy. To Isadora, this wasn't a protective measure but an insult, proof of Arthur's distrust. Her determination hardened into obsession. If she couldn't control the money directly, she would control the narrative and the physical assets. The auction became even more important, a symbolic act of her authority. The Saturday of the book fair arrived with a clear blue sky. Lena, her heart pounding, walked among the bookstalls, always under a monitor's watchful eye. She saw Mrs. Eleanor sitting on a bench near the gazebo, pretending to read a newspaper. As planned, Lena asked for permission to use the restroom. The monitor, distracted by a conversation with another teacher, pointed the way and gave her 5 minutes. It was all the time she needed. She ran not to the restroom, but to the bench where the old woman was waiting. "Mrs. Eleanor," she gasped. The old woman hugged her. "I knew you'd come. What's happened, my dear?" In a rushed voice, Lena told her everything. The note, The code word, the key, the safe, the USB drive. Mrs. Eleanor listened, her eyes widening with each revelation. "My dad, he's alive," Lena whispered. The phrase sounding real for the first time. "I don't know where, but he's coming back, and he left a video, proof." She didn't have the USB drive with her. It was too risky, but she had her memory. Mrs. Eleanor took Lena's hands. "Your father was a forward-thinking man. He once told me the greatest protection for his estate wasn't in the bank's treasury, but in the rules he created to protect the ones he loved." The old woman glanced at the clock tower. "Lena's time was running out. Don't you worry, child. Now that I know the truth, I won't be silent any longer. They may have the keys to the house, but we have the key to the truth." Mrs. Eleanor was not a woman for direct confrontation. Her strength lay in observation, patience, and a deep sense of community, a web of relationships built over decades in the neighborhood. She knew that attacking Isadora head-on would be like shouting into the wind. The answer was to plant a seed of doubt and let it germinate in the fertile soil of local gossip. The next morning, she sat at her usual table at the Town Square Cafe, a hub where neighborhood news was exchanged more efficiently than in any newspaper. It wasn't long before Marissa, the wife of an influential banker, sat down with her. Between a sip of cappuccino and a bite of cake, Mrs. Eleanor sighed, a sigh laden with false melancholy. "Oh, Marissa, I still think about that memorial for poor Arthur. So elegant. Isadora has admirable strength." She paused as if hesitant to continue. "But you know what I found odd? Those happy couple photos on the projector. One of them, from his birthday, was labeled as last year. But I remember clearly, last year they were on a business trip to Tokyo. Arthur sent me a postcard." She shrugged, a dismissive gesture. "It must be my memory playing tricks on me. But it's strange how grief can muddle the dates, isn't it?" The seed was planted. Marissa, whose husband was one of the directors at Arthur's bank, filed the information away with keen interest. Small inconsistencies, in her world, were often the tip of an iceberg. A few miles away, in an anonymous office with tinted windows, Arthur Albright listened to the report from his lawyer, Horace. The fury he'd felt in the garden had sharpened into surgical precision. On the table between them was a stack of documents, bank statements, call logs, private investigator reports. She tried to access the main investment funds the day after the memorial, Horace said, pointing to a paragraph. "She was blocked by the protective clauses you insisted on including. The trust board was automatically engaged. Since then, she's been making inquiries about liquidating other assets, stocks, some commercial properties. And now this." He pushed a glossy brochure across the table. A photo of the mansion graced the cover, with the title, "Auction of a Visionary's Legacy." Arthur's blood ran cold. He flipped through the pages, seeing photos of his most personal belongings, each with a lot number. His watch collection, the rare books he'd inherited from his grandfather, even the small wooden sailboat he and Lena had built together one Sunday afternoon. "And they're not just trying to steal my assets," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. "They're trying to erase my existence." Horace nodded. "The auction is tomorrow afternoon. It's a bold move. She wants to create a done deal, generate a cash flow that escapes the trust's control, and simultaneously position herself as the benevolent curator of your legacy." Arthur's gaze was like steel. "Then that's where we'll make our move. Not before. I want all her guests, all the press she's undoubtedly invited, to be present. I want witnesses." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where he'd built his empire. The injustice against his daughter was an open wound, and the only way to heal it was to expose the truth in a way that was beyond question. In the silence of the office, he made his final decision, the plan forming in his mind with crystalline clarity. He turned to Horace, a determined glint in his eyes. "Prepare the documents, all of them. The clauses, The reports, the proof of Lena's expulsion. Tomorrow, the curtain falls on Isadora's performance. The night before the auction was the longest of Lena's life. Lying in her narrow bed at the academy, she listened to the building's nocturnal sounds, the distant creak of a door, the cough of a roommate, the incessant ticking of the clock in the hall. Each sound seemed to mark the countdown to the possible dissolution of her memories. She clutched the anchor key in her hand, the cool metal a counterpoint to the heat of her nervousness. Fear and hope waged a silent battle in her chest. What if the plan failed? What if her father didn't show up? The doubt was a cold shadow threatening to swallow the small flame of courage his message had lit. She thought of Mrs. Eleanor's face, the firmness in her eyes, and Celeste's silent loyalty. She wasn't completely alone. That realization was her anchor, her safe harbor in that night of uncertainty. On the morning of the auction, the mansion buzzed with a tense, artificial energy. Florists put the final touches on lavish arrangements, uniformed waiters polished crystal glasses, and the auction house staff placed the last tags on the lots. Isadora supervised it all with a hawk's eye, her makeup flawless, her smile polished. But beneath the facade of the perfect hostess, anxiety gnawed at her edges. The bank's resistance had left her in a more fragile position than she cared to admit. This auction was crucial, not just for the money, but to reassert her authority, to show everyone that she, and she alone, was in command of the Albright legacy. Richard, on the other hand, was at the peak of his ambition. He circulated among the appraisers, discussing opening bids and profit potential, his eyes shining with the prospect of turning history into capital. He was already making plans for the money, imagining daring investments and his definitive entry into the circle of prestige he so coveted. In a moment of confidence, he approached Isadora. "If Arthur could see this," and he said, with a tone of false reverence, "he'd be proud of how you're turning the past into the future." He even suggested that after the auction, they should see the lawyers. "Maybe we can contest the will, claim his absence was abandonment. We could even sue the estate." Isadora silenced him with a look. His opportunism, once useful, now struck her as crass, dangerous. She was playing a chess game, and Richard was an impatient pawn. Meanwhile, in her modest apartment, Mrs. Eleanor made her own move. She called two of the most influential and gossipy neighbors, women whose opinions shaped the community's social perception. "You won't believe what I found out," she said, her voice charged with a conspiratorial urgency. "Remember that photo at the memorial with the wrong date? Well, it seems there's more. Celeste told me poor little Lena was sent to a boarding school that very day, the same day. Isadora said it was to reorganize the house. What kind of grieving is that?" The news spread like wildfire. By the time the first guests began to arrive for the auction, the atmosphere was already charged not just with curiosity, but with suspicion. Whispers started in the corners. Glances were exchanged over the rims of champagne glasses. Isadora's perfect narrative was beginning to crack. The academy car pulled up to the mansion's gate. Lena, dressed in a simple blue dress Celeste had managed to buy for her, took a deep breath. The monitor accompanying her had instructions to leave her in Celeste's care and then depart. As she got out of the car, Lena saw the commotion, the luxury cars, the unfamiliar faces. Her heart was hammering. She was such a small piece in this game of giants, but she had the key, and she had the truth. With her head held high, she walked through the gate, up the same steps she had been cast down weeks before. Her entrance went unnoticed by most, but Mrs. Eleanor, who had just arrived, saw her. The old woman gave her an encouraging smile and an almost imperceptible nod. Lena entered the house, her eyes searching for Celeste. She found her near the staircase, her face pale but resolute. The housekeeper guided her silently toward the library, where the auctioneer was already preparing. The room was full, the air heavy with the scent of perfume and greed. Lena hid behind a heavy curtain, her small body trembling. The auctioneer banged his gavel on the table, the sharp, final sound echoing through the room, demanding silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We will begin the auction with lot number 1. The first item up for auction was a gold wristwatch, a piece Arthur only wore on special occasions. Lena recognized it immediately. She remembered its weight in her small hand when her father would let her wind it. The auctioneer described its qualities in a professional monotone, speaking of its rarity, its Swiss mechanism, its market value. To Lena, he was describing an empty shell, devoid of the story that truly mattered. The sparkle in her father's eye when he wore it on their wedding day, or the way its soft ticking soothed her when she couldn't sleep. The bidding began, anonymous voices in the crowd offering numbers that sounded absurd. Isadora watched from a velvet armchair, a small smile of satisfaction on her lips. Each bid was a validation of her power, a confirmation that the past could be efficiently converted into profit. Richard stood near the window, beaming, subtly nodding his approval with each rising figure. The tension in the room was purely financial, a cold competition for possession. But for Lena, hidden behind the curtain, the tension was visceral. Where was he? The promise of the video, the hope planted by Mrs. Eleanor and Celeste. All of it felt fragile against the brutal reality of that gavel falling, selling her life piece by piece. The watch was sold. The auctioneer moved on to the next lot, a collection of fountain pens. The bidding resumed. Lena closed her eyes, tears burning. She felt powerless, a spectator at her own annihilation. It was then that a sound cut through the room's atmosphere. It wasn't loud, but it was so unexpected that all conversations ceased. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock, coming not from the library's main entrance, but from a small, often forgotten service door that led to the back corridor. The door opened slowly, with a faint groan from its hinges. Every head turned. At first, the figure who appeared in the doorway was just a silhouette against the hall's light. But as he took a step into the room, a collective gasp swept through the crowd. It was Arthur Albright. He didn't look like a ghost or a man returned from the dead. He simply looked like himself, dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit. His face was thinner, perhaps a little more tired, but his eyes held an intensity that silenced the entire room. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, and in his right hand, swinging gently from his index finger, was a small brass key with an anchor charm. The silence was absolute, dense, heavy. The auctioneer froze with his gavel in midair. A catalogue slipped from a guest's hand, the soft flutter sounding like a thunderclap in the stillness. Isadora's eyes widened in shock, disbelief, and finally panic. The color drained from her face, leaving behind the mask of makeup. Richard took an instinctive step back, as if he'd seen an apparition, his triumphant expression crumbling into pure fear. Arthur scanned the room, meeting every pair of eyes, letting his presence settle, letting the reality of the impossible situation become undeniable. His gaze finally landed on the curtain where Lena was hiding. He gave her an almost imperceptible smile, a signal just for her. In that moment, Lena's fear dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming wave of relief and love. He was here. He had come back. The auctioneer's gavel finally fell, not with the force of a final bid, but with a dull thud, slipping from his slack hand and rolling onto the floor. The auction was over. The real show was about to begin. The silence in the library was a living thing, an entity that pressed on the eardrums. It was Isadora's voice that broke it, a shrill, trembling sound, her last attempt to control the stage. "Arthur, what is the meaning of this? Is this some kind of sick joke, letting us all think that you were gone?" She stood up, practiced outrage in her posture, her hand on her chest. "How dare you put us through this?" Arthur didn't move. His eyes, however, were as hard as diamonds. "There's no performance here. Isadora, only facts." He gestured to the door, and Horace, his lawyer, entered, carrying a briefcase. He moved with quiet efficiency, connecting a small projector to a laptop. You organized a memorial for a man who was merely incommunicado for security reasons, Arthur continued, his voice calm but cutting, aimed not just at her but at the entire room. And you used that pretext to make decisions I would never have approved. The first image projected on the white wall behind the auctioneer's podium was Arthur's face from the same video Lena had watched. "If you're watching this," the recorded voice echoed through the room, "it's because something has prevented me from returning." The impact on the audience was immediate. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was no impulsive reappearance. It was the execution of a plan. "As you can see," Horace said, taking the floor as the video ended, "Mr. Albright anticipated the possibility of manipulation. But he did more than record a warning." The lawyer took a folder from his briefcase. He established a family trust, the clauses of which are quite clear. He held up a document. Clause 7.2. The direct heir, Lena Albright, has absolute priority in all decisions regarding the estate and her well-being. Clause 9.4. Any guardian or administrator proven to have humiliated, neglected, or expelled the heir from her primary residence will have their access to all funds and properties immediately revoked, followed by a residential restraining order. Isadora's breath caught in her throat. Richard was as pale as a ghost. "And we have proof of the expulsion," Arthur said, his gaze finding Mrs. Eleanor's at the back of the room. With quiet courage, the old woman stepped forward. Her voice, though soft, resonated with the force of truth. "I saw it with my own two eyes. On the day of the memorial, the child was put out at the gate, suitcase in hand. I took her in until this lady," she pointed at Isadora, "came and took her away by force." The testimony of the neighborhood's most respected resident was the final blow. Isadora's narrative disintegrated completely. Arthur then delivered the verdict, not with anger, but with the final authority of law and fact. "This auction is cancelled. Miss Isadora's and Mr. Richard's access to all accounts and properties is blocked as of this moment, pending a full audit, and you both have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and leave this house." Isadora and Richard stood paralyzed, speechless. They hadn't just lost the money, they had lost the stage, their credibility, their face. They were actors without an audience, in a suddenly dark theater. Amidst the silent chaos, the curtain stirred. Lena took a hesitant step out from her hiding place, her large eyes fixed on her father. The world around them seemed to melt away. She walked toward him, trembling slightly. In a whisper that could barely be heard, she asked the question that was in her heart. "Can I go back to my room now?" Arthur knelt, bringing himself down to her level, and took her hand. The familiar warmth enveloped her. His eyes were misty, but his voice was the steadiest, safest thing she had ever heard. "Your room was always yours, my little star. I'm the one who's coming home." Isadora and Richard's departure was not dramatic. It was quiet, almost pathetic. Faced with the exposed truth and irrefutable clauses, all their bravado dissolved, leaving only two unmasked opportunists. They gathered their belongings under Horace's watchful eye, avoiding eye contact with the few guests who still remained, stunned by the turn of events. The mansion, which minutes before had been buzzing with greed and falsehood, emptied out quickly, leaving behind a dense silence filled with unspoken words. It was Celeste who broke the spell, approaching with a cup of chamomile tea for Lena. Arthur thanked the housekeeper with a look that was worth more than any financial bonus. He then walked over to Mrs. Eleanor. "I will never forget what you did," he said, his voice thick with genuine gratitude. The old woman smiled, her eyes welling up. "I just looked after a good man's daughter. The real fortune, Arthur, is the bonds we build, not the assets we accumulate." The house became just a house again. Arthur took Lena's hand and led her up the stairs, past the room where the auction had been stopped in its tracks. They entered her bedroom, which remained exactly as she had left it. The patchwork quilt, the small bookshelf with her favorite books, the drawing of a sailboat taped to the wall. It was an untouched sanctuary. Lena ran and hugged her teddy bear, burying her face in its worn fur. "I thought I'd never come back," she whispered. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed, his heart aching. "I am so sorry, my daughter. I'm sorry my absence allowed this to happen. No investment, no business trip is worth what you went through. I made a mistake, thinking that protecting our assets was the same as protecting you. From today on, my only business, my only cash flow, my primary asset is your happiness." In the days that followed, the mansion began to transform. The cold scent of lilies was replaced by the warm aroma of chocolate chip cookies, which Celeste made sure to bake every afternoon. Lena's laughter began to echo through the hallways again. One morning, Arthur took her to the library. "This place," he said, running his hand along the spine of the book, Voyages of Discovery, "was our safe harbor, and I want it to be a harbor for other people too." He revealed his plan to turn the vast private library into a community study hall, a free and safe space for the children of the neighborhood. It would be an investment of his capital into something that would generate no interest or dividends, but a different kind of profit, one not measured in dollars. The Harbor Foundation, as he named it, would be his family's true legacy, proof that the greatest wealth is that which is shared. From her window across the street, Mrs. Eleanor watched the lights of the Albright mansion burn late into the night. She no longer saw lavish parties, but the silhouette of a father helping his daughter with her homework. Justice had arrived, not with the noise of revenge, but with the quiet of restored normalcy. On the grand piano, where a lifeless vase of flowers once stood, there was now a single photograph: Arthur, Lena, and Celeste, smiling in the kitchen, covered in flour. It was the image of a real family, imperfect and finally at peace. The truth, exposed with method and love, had traded appearance for life.